December 20th, 1943. High above the frozen German countryside, a Messerschmitt Bf-209 closed in on its prey. Inside the cockpit, Oberleutnant Franz Stigler's gloved hand rested on the control stick, his thumb hovering over the cannon trigger. Before him, struggling through the thin air at 12,000 feet, was a Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, or what was left of one. The American bomber was dying. That much was obvious even from 200 yards out. Black smoke trailed from its shattered engines. Gaping holes punctured its fuselage like a sieve. The entire nose section looked as though a giant fist had smashed through the plexiglass. It wobbled through the sky like a wounded bird, hemorrhaging altitude with every passing second. This was the shot Franz Stigler had been waiting for, his 28th kill. One more victory, and the Knight's Cross would be his, Germany's highest military honor. His career, his legacy, perhaps even his survival in this brutal war, hung in the balance of this single moment. The crippled bomber couldn't defend itself. The turrets weren't tracking him. No tracers came his way. It was defenseless. It was perfect. Franz edged his fighter closer, positioning himself for the kill shot. Standard procedure dictated a burst into the wing root where the fuel tank sat waiting to ignite. Or perhaps the cockpit, quick, efficient, final. His commanding officers would be pleased. His fellow pilots would celebrate another American bomber removed from the skies over the fatherland. But as Franz pulled alongside the stricken bomber, close enough now to see inside the shattered fuselage, something stopped him. His finger froze on the trigger. Through the gaping wounds in the B-117 side, he could see the crew. Young men, boys really, scrambling inside the torn metal hull. One man lay motionless in the tailgun position, clearly dead. Another sat in the waist, wounded, being tended by a comrade. In the cockpit, two pilots fought desperately with the controls, their faces pale with exhaustion and fear. Franz Stigler had been taught to kill. He'd been trained by the Luftwaffe's best. He'd shot down Allied bombers and fighters across North Africa and now over Europe. He was an ace, a professional killer of the skies. But he'd also been taught something else, something that now echoed in his mind with the voice of his mentor, Gustav Rudel. "If I ever see or hear of you shooting at a man in a parachute, I will shoot you down myself." Franz looked at the shattered bomber again, at the exposed crew, at the impossibility of this aircraft making it home. This wasn't a bomber anymore. This was a parachute. These men were already dead. They just didn't know it yet. And in that frozen moment, 12,000 feet above Germany, Franz Stigler made a decision that would haunt him, define him, and ultimately redeem him for the rest of his life. He didn't fire. Call to action. Before we dive deeper into this extraordinary true story of honor, courage, and humanity in the midst of history's most brutal war, I'd like to ask you to do something. If you appreciate these detailed accounts of aviation history, the technical details, the personal stories, the moments that define what it means to be human even in war, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel. And I'd genuinely love to know, where are you listening from today? Are you a veteran yourself? Did a family member serve in the war? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one, and your stories and perspectives make this community what it is. Now, let's go back to where this story really begins, not in the sky over Germany, but on an airfield in England in the early morning darkness of December 20th, 1943. ACT 1. The mission briefing. The base at Kimbleton, England, home to the 37th Bombardment Group, was shrouded in the pre-dawn gloom that characterized English winters. Inside the briefing room, rows of airmen sat on hard wooden benches, smoking cigarettes and drinking bitter coffee, waiting for the curtain to be pulled back from the wall map. They knew the routine. The length of the ribbon stretching from England to the target would tell them everything they needed to know about how bad today was going to be. When the curtain finally drew back, a collective groan rippled through the room. Bremen. Deep penetration into Germany. The ribbon stretched far across the North Sea, over the German coast, and inland to one of the most heavily defended industrial cities in the Reich. Second Lieutenant Charles "Charlie" Brown felt his stomach tighten. This was only his second mission to Germany, but it was his first as an aircraft commander, the pilot in charge of his own B-17 and its 10-man crew. At 21 years old, he was responsible for bringing 9 other young men home alive. The weight of that responsibility sat heavy on his shoulders as he studied the map. Charlie was a farm boy from Weston, West Virginia. He'd grown up with dirt under his fingernails and an understanding of machinery that came from fixing tractors and combines. Flying had been a dream, one that seemed impossibly distant from the rolling hills of West Virginia, but the war had changed everything. The Army Air Forces needed pilots, needed them desperately, and Charlie had volunteered. Now, after months of training stateside, he was here, in England, preparing to fly into the teeth of the Luftwaffe's defenses. The intelligence officer's voice droned on, detailing the target, the Focke-Wulf aircraft factory at Bremen. This was where the Germans built the W-90, one of their most effective fighters. Knocking out this factory meant fewer German fighters in the sky. It meant more American and British bombers making it home. It meant, perhaps, bringing this terrible war to an end just a little bit sooner. But first, they had to get there. And back. The briefing covered the route, the altitude they'd be forming up at 27,000 feet, the expected flak concentrations, and the fighter opposition. Intelligence suggested heavy resistance. The Luftwaffe wouldn't let them bomb this factory without a fight. Expected losses, moderate to heavy, the intelligence officer said matter-of-factly, as though he were discussing the weather rather than the probable death of dozens of young men. Charlie looked at his crew as they filed out of the briefing. He'd trained with most of them stateside, but some were replacements, new faces filling slots left empty by casualties. His co-pilot, Second Lieutenant Spencer "Pinky" Luke, was experienced. He'd flown several missions before being assigned to Charlie's crew. That was a relief. The rest were good men, competent at their positions, but they were all so young. Staff Sergeant Hugh Eckenrode, the tail gunner, was just 20 years old. Sergeant Alex Yelisenko, the left waist gunner, carried a photograph of his girl back home tucked into his flight jacket. Technical Sergeant Samuel Blackford, the radio operator, had a habit of humming Glenn Miller tunes during pre-flight checks. These were the men Charlie was responsible for. These were the lives in his hands. The aircraft, B-17F, Flying Fortress. Before we follow Charlie Brown into the sky, we need to understand the machine he was about to take into combat. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress wasn't just an airplane. It was a technological marvel, a feat of engineering that represented the industrial might of the United States. The B-17F model that Charlie would be flying that day was the third major production variant of the Flying Fortress. It stretched 74 feet from nose to tail, with a wingspan of nearly 104 feet. Empty, it weighed 36,000 pounds. Fully loaded with fuel, bombs, ammunition, and crew, it could weigh up to 65,000 pounds. Getting that much weight off the ground and keeping it in the air required 4 Wright R-1820 Cyclone engines, each producing 1,200 horsepower. The designation Flying Fortress wasn't marketing hyperbole. It was an accurate description of the aircraft's defensive philosophy. The B-17 bristled with 50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns. The F model carried 13 of them, 2 in the nose, 2 in the dorsal turret, 2 in the ventral ball turret, 2 in the tail, and 1 each at the 2 waist positions and the radio room. These weren't light weapons. The E-50 caliber round could punch through armor plate and could tear a fighter aircraft apart at close range. The theory was simple. If you flew your B-17s in tight formation, their combined firepower would create an impenetrable box of lead that no fighter could penetrate. Attacking a formation of B-17s was supposed to be suicide for enemy fighters. That was the theory. Reality, as Charlie and his crew would soon discover, was considerably more complicated. The B-17 structure was designed to absorb tremendous punishment. Unlike fighters, which were built for speed and maneuverability, the Fortress was built to take hits and keep flying. Its aluminum skin was relatively thick for an aircraft. Its control surfaces had redundancy built in. Critical systems had backup systems. Stories already circulated among the bomber crews of B-17s, making it home with catastrophic damage, engines shot out, entire sections of fuselage missing, tail surfaces shredded. The airplane had earned a reputation for bringing its crews home when, by all rights, it should have fallen from the sky. Charlie's assigned aircraft for this mission was B-17F serial number 423567, nicknamed Ye Olde Pub. It was a relatively new aircraft, having arrived at Kimballton just a few weeks earlier. The nose art featured a cartoon character that one of the ground crew had painted on during a rare sunny afternoon. Charlie had flown it once before on a milk run to France, a relatively easy mission with light opposition. Today would be different. ACT-20 into the teeth of the beast. The takeoff from Kimballton was routine. Charlie advanced the throttles, felt the four Cyclone engines roar to life, and guided Ye Olde Pub down the runway. At 65,000 pounds, the B-17 needed every foot of concrete. The tail came up. The airspeed indicator climbed. At 110 miles per hour, Charlie eased back on the yoke, and the Fortress lifted into the gray English morning. They formed up over the English coast, hundreds of bombers arranging themselves into their assigned positions in the combat box formation. From the ground, it must have been an impressive sight, the sky filled with silver aircraft, contrails streaming behind them, all heading east toward Germany. The North Sea crossing was uneventful. Inside the unpressurized aircraft, the crew put on their oxygen masks as they climbed through 10,000 feet. At 27,000 feet, the temperature inside the aircraft dropped to 40 degrees below zero Fahrenheit. Despite their heavy leather flight jackets, electrically heated suits, and layers of wool, the cold was numbing. Charlie's hands on the controls grew stiff despite his gloves. His breath froze on the inside of his oxygen mask. This was normal. This was what they'd trained for. The discomfort was something you pushed through, ignored, because the mission required it. The German coast appeared ahead. Almost immediately, the flak started. For those who've never experienced it, anti-aircraft fire flak is difficult to describe. The German 88mm and 105mm anti-aircraft guns fired shells that climbed to altitude and then exploded, sending shrapnel in all directions. From the ground, the gunners couldn't see individual aircraft at 27,000 feet. They fired into the box formation, creating a zone of exploding metal that the bombers had to fly through. From inside a B-17, flak appeared as black puffs of smoke that materialized in the sky around you. Each puff represented an explosion, shrapnel traveling at supersonic speeds in a deadly radius. If you were lucky, the puffs stayed at a distance. If you were unlucky, you heard the sound, a sharp crack, like someone hitting the fuselage with a hammer, followed by the whistle of wind through new holes in your airplane. Today, Charlie wasn't lucky. The flak over the German coast was intense. Black puffs filled the sky around the formation. Charlie heard the hammer blows of shrapnel puncturing Ye Olde Pub's skin. In the back, the waist gunners called out holes appearing in the fuselage. A piece of shrapnel punched through the cockpit windscreen between Charlie and Pinky, missing both men by inches. The plexiglass starred but held. But this was just the coast. The real defenses waited ahead at Bremen. The Luftwaffe fighters appeared at 12 o'clock high, the position directly ahead and above the bomber formation. They came in packs, Messerschmitt Bf-209s and Focke-Wulf Fuvli 190s, diving through the formation with their cannons blazing. The sky filled with tracers, red lines from the German fighters, white and orange from the American bombers. Inside Ye Olde Pub, the intercom exploded with radio chatter. Bandits, 12 o'clock high. Fighter coming in, 3 o'clock level. Watch that 100. The 50 calibers hammered, their sound deafening even through the leather flying helmets and the roar of the engines. Charlie kept his position in the formation. That was the key to survival. Stay tight, keep your aircraft in position so the defensive firepower overlapped. Break formation, and you were alone. Alone meant dead. The bomb run over Bremen was a nightmare. The flak was the heaviest Charlie had ever seen, a solid carpet of black bursts that the formation had to fly through. You couldn't dodge flak. You couldn't outmaneuver it. You could only fly straight and level on the bomb run, maintaining precise airspeed and altitude so the bombardier could line up the target in his Norden bomb site. For 6 minutes, 6 minutes that felt like 6 hours, ye olde pub flew through that storm of exploding metal. Charlie felt impacts all over the aircraft. The bomber shuddered with each hit. Red lights appeared on the instrument panel as systems failed. But the bombs had to drop on target. That was the mission. That was what they'd come here to do. Bombs away! The bombardier's voice crackled over the intercom. Charlie felt the aircraft lurch upward as 4,000 pounds of high explosive fell free of the bomb bay. The formation began its turn, heading back toward England, toward home, toward safety. That's when everything went to hell. ACT-3, the crippling blow. The Fu-190 came out of nowhere, a gray blur diving from above at over 400 miles per hour. Its 20mm cannons and machine guns opened fire from point-blank range. Charlie saw the muzzle flashes, saw the tracers walking toward his aircraft, and then the windscreen exploded inward. Plexiglass shards and freezing air blasted into the cockpit. The control stick jerked in Charlie's hands as cannon shells tore through the nose section. Alarm screamed. The aircraft shuddered, yawed hard to the right. Charlie fought the controls, his ears ringing from the explosions. "We're hit! We're hit bad!" Someone screamed over the intercom. Engine number 2. The inboard engine on the left wing was on fire. Charlie could see flames streaming back from the cowling black smoke pouring into the slipstream. He reached for the fire suppression controls, pulled the handle for engine 2, and watched helplessly as the fire continued to burn. The suppression system had been damaged in the attack. Engine number 4, the outboard engine on the right wing, was windmilling uselessly, its propeller spinning freely with no power. Hit. Probably the oil system. Without oil pressure, the engine would seize up completely within minutes. The hydraulic pressure gauge dropped to 0. That meant no turrets, no brakes for landing, and the controls would be heavy. It would take all of Charlie's and Pinky's strength to move the ailerons and elevator. The oxygen system alarm light glowed red. Somewhere in the fuselage, the oxygen lines had been severed. At this altitude, without oxygen, the crew had perhaps 10 minutes before they passed out. "Get your walk-around bottles," Charlie ordered over the intercom. Each crewman had a portable oxygen bottle that could buy them a few extra minutes. "And check in. I need status reports." The responses came in one by one, but Sergeant Hugh Eckenrode in the tail didn't answer. Alex Yelasanko, the left waist gunner, made his way aft to check on him. What he found would haunt him for the rest of his life. A 20mm cannon shell had hit Eckenrode's position directly. The 20-year-old tail gunner was dead, his body slumped in his station. There was nothing Yelasanko could do. He reported the loss to Charlie, his voice breaking over the intercom. Charlie felt the news like a physical blow. Eckenrode was dead, gone. The first man Charlie had lost under his command. But there was no time to grieve, no time to process the horror. 8 other men depended on him to get them home. He had to focus. Ye olde pub was falling out of formation. With only 2 engines producing power, one on each wing, and with the massive drag from the damage, Charlie couldn't maintain altitude or airspeed. The bomber dropped below and behind the formation, wallowing through the air like a wounded animal. This was a death sentence. Stragler's bombers separated from the formation were easy prey for German fighters. Without the concentrated firepower of the formation's defensive box, a lone B-17 could be picked apart at the fighter's leisure. Charlie pointed the nose down, trading what little altitude he had for airspeed. Maybe if he could dive away, could get down into the cloud layer below, they'd have a chance. It was a desperate plan, but it was the only plan he had. They dropped through 15,000 feet, 12,000, 10,000. The clouds were below them now, tantalizingly close. If they could just reach that gray cover, they might disappear from the German fighters' view. Engine number 2 finally seized, the fire having consumed its internal components. The propeller froze in place, creating massive drag. The aircraft yawed hard to the left. Charlie and Pinky stood on the right rudder pedal, forcing the aircraft back to level flight. Their legs trembled with the effort. At 8,000 feet, they entered the cloud layer. Gray mist enveloped the bomber. For a brief moment, Charlie allowed himself to hope. Maybe they'd make it. Maybe they'd... They broke through the bottom of the clouds at 5,000 feet, and Charlie's heart sank. Below them stretched the German countryside, clear and visible. And worse, far worse, he could see a German airfield directly ahead. Small dots were moving on the field. Fighters, being scrambled to intercept them. "We're not going to make it," Pinky said quietly. It wasn't defeatism. It was simply a statement of fact. 2 engines out, 1 on fire earlier, massive structural damage, oxygen depleted, hydraulics gone, and now German fighters scrambling below them. The mathematics of survival didn't add up. But Charlie didn't give up. He couldn't. He adjusted their heading, trying to avoid flying directly over the airfield. Maybe if they could skirt around it. Maybe if the fighters took too long to get airborne. That's when Franz Stigler saw them. A.C.T. Fuhr, the hunter. Oberleutnant Franz Stigler had been in the middle of refueling his Messerschmitt Bf 109 G6 when he spotted the American bomber. He'd just landed at the airfield near Oldenburg after engaging the bomber stream over Bremen. His fighter had taken minor damage, a few holes in the tail section, but nothing serious. He'd expended most of his ammunition without scoring a kill, which frustrated him. He was so close to his 28th victory, so close to the Knight's Cross. The ground crew was swarming over his fighter, pumping fuel into the tanks, when Franz saw the crippled B-17 stagger across the sky at low altitude. Even from a distance, he could see the damage. The bomber was a wreck, barely flying, trailing smoke. Franz made a decision in seconds. He waved off the ground crew, climbed back into his cockpit, and fired up the Daimler-Benz DB605 engine. This was it. This was his 28th kill, the one that would earn him the Knight's Cross. The Bf 2109 G6 was a magnificent aircraft, a thoroughbred racing machine compared to the lumbering B-17. It weighed just 7,000 pounds fully loaded, less than a tenth of the bomber's weight. Its 1,475 horsepower engine pushed it to speeds exceeding 380 miles per hour. It could climb, dive, and turn with an agility that the B-17 couldn't hope to match. In the hands of an ace like Franz Stigler, the Bf 109 was a scalpel to the B-117 sledgehammer. Franz took off and quickly spotted the American bomber. He climbed above and behind it, positioning himself in the classic 6 o'clock high attack position directly behind and above the target, where most of the bomber's defensive guns couldn't reach. He closed the distance, his finger moving to the trigger. The B-17 grew larger in his gun sight. He could see every detail now. The shredded metal, the holes in the fuselage, the frozen blood streaking the tail section. And that's when Franz hesitated. He pulled his Bf 2019 alongside the bomber, flying formation just 50 yards off its right wing, close enough to see inside the shattered aircraft, close enough to see the crew. Franz had flown combat missions across North Africa and Europe. He'd shot down Allied fighters and bombers. He'd seen men die. War had hardened him, as it hardened all combat veterans. But what he saw inside that B-17 affected him in a way he didn't expect. The tail gunner was dead, that much was obvious. His body hung limply in the shattered tail turret. In the waist section, a wounded gunner sat on the floor, being tended by a comrade. The man looked up, saw Franz's fighter, and his eyes went wide with terror. He didn't even try to reach for his gun. He simply stared, waiting for death. In the cockpit, 2 pilots fought desperately with the controls. Their faces were pale, exhausted, determined. They'd seen Franz's fighter. They knew what was coming. But they kept fighting their dying aircraft, kept trying to coax it toward home. Franz had been trained at the Luftwaffe fighter school at Vernuken. His instructor, Gustav Rudel, was a knight of the sky from the old school, a veteran who'd fought in the Spanish Civil War and believed in a code of honor even in war. Rodel had taught his students how to shoot, how to hunt, how to kill. But he'd also taught them something else. Honor is everything, Rodel had said. If I ever see or hear of you shooting at a man in a parachute, I will shoot you down myself. A parachute, a defenseless man descending from a destroyed aircraft. Shooting a man in a parachute wasn't combat, it was murder. Franz looked at the shattered B-17 again, at the exposed crew, at the impossibility of this aircraft making it home across the North Sea to England. These men were as good as dead already. The bomber was a coffin struggling through the sky. It was a parachute, and Franz Stigler could not bring himself to shoot. The decision. Franz eased his Bf-109 even closer to the bomber, close enough that the pilots could see him clearly. He could see their eyes widen in shock as they realized the German fighter wasn't attacking. He gestured, pointing to the south and west. Sweden, neutral Sweden, where the crew could land and be interned for the duration of the war. It was their only chance. In the B-17's cockpit, Charlie Brown didn't understand what was happening. His mind, oxygen-deprived and exhausted, couldn't process it. A German fighter was flying formation with them, gesturing, pointing, but not shooting. Why wasn't he shooting? Is he trying to get us to land? Pinky asked, his voice confused. I don't know, Charlie said, but I'm not landing in Germany. We're going home. Franz saw that the American pilot wasn't following his guidance. The bomber continued on its westward heading, toward the North Sea, toward England. It was suicide. The aircraft would never make it that far. The bomber would fall from the sky, crash into the sea, and all these men would die in the freezing water. But Franz understood. These were bomber crews. They'd been briefed on what happened to downed airmen in Germany. Interrogation, prison camps, the uncertainty of survival. Going home, even if it seemed impossible, was better than capture. So Franz made another decision. He would escort them. The escort. For the next 20 miles, Franz Stigler flew formation on the crippled B-17. He positioned his fighter on the bomber's right wing, clearly visible to any German flak gunners on the ground. This was genius and incredibly dangerous. German flak gunners were trained not to fire when Luftwaffe fighters were near Allied bombers. The risk of hitting their own aircraft was too high. By flying in formation with the B-17, Franz was creating a protective bubble around the American bomber. The flak guns stayed silent. But if any of his fellow Luftwaffe pilots spotted him, if anyone at his base discovered what he was doing, it would be the end of his career at minimum. At worst, it would be a firing squad. Aiding the enemy was treason. The penalties were clear. Franz didn't care. Inside Ye Olde Pub, the crew watched in stunned disbelief. The German fighter stayed with them, matching their speed, flying so close they could see the pilot's face. Some of the crew thought he was herding them toward a prison camp. Others thought he was toying with them, drawing out their death. Charlie simply focused on flying, on keeping the dying bomber in the air for one more minute, one more mile. They crossed the German coastline. The North Sea stretched before them, gray and hostile. Franz knew this was as far as he could go. If he followed them out over the water, he wouldn't have enough fuel to return to base. And he'd certainly be spotted by other German fighters or by the radar stations along the coast. He pulled closer to the bomber one final time, made eye contact with the American pilot. Charlie Brown looked back at him, and for a brief moment, two warriors acknowledged each other across the Gulf of War. Franz snapped a crisp salute. Charlie, nearly delirious with exhaustion and oxygen deprivation, instinctively returned it. Franz Stigler peeled away, banking his BF-109 hard to the right, and disappeared back toward Germany. Inside the B-17, the crew finally allowed themselves to hope. ACT-5, the long flight home. The North Sea crossing was a nightmare. Ye Olde Pub wallowed through the air on two failing engines, losing altitude slowly but steadily. Charlie and Pinky took turns on the controls, their arms and legs burning with fatigue from the constant fight with the heavy control surfaces. The crew threw out everything that wasn't bolted down. Guns, ammunition, the dead tail gunner's body, a brutal necessity to save weight that would haunt them forever, equipment, even their personal belongings. Every pound mattered. The English coast appeared ahead like a mirage. They'd made it across the North Sea, an achievement that seemed impossible an hour ago. But they still had to land. With no hydraulics, Charlie had no brakes and minimal control over the flaps. The landing gear was questionable. It operated on hydraulic pressure, and with that system dead, Charlie wasn't sure the wheels would lock down. He selected the first airfield he saw, a small RAF base on the coast. He didn't have the fuel to be choosy. This would have to do. The landing gear cranked down mechanically, but the indicator lights didn't show a positive lock. Charlie had to hope the gear would hold when they touched down. He lined up on the runway, the B-17 mushing through the air at the edge of a stall. They hit hard. The landing gear held. Without brakes, Ye Olde Pub rolled the entire length of the runway and off onto the grass beyond, before finally grinding to a stop. Charlie shut down the two remaining engines. The sudden silence was deafening. For a moment, nobody moved. They'd made it. Against every odd, against every reasonable expectation, they'd made it home. Charlie and his crew climbed out of the bomber and collapsed on the grass. British RAF personnel rushed over, stopping in shock when they saw the damage to the aircraft. The nose was shattered. Hundreds of holes punctured the fuselage. The tail section was barely attached. One RAF mechanic walked around the bomber and counted over 200 separate flak and bullet holes. "How the bloody hell did you fly this thing home?" he asked. Charlie didn't have an answer. The aftermath. The investigation into what happened to Ye Olde Pub was routine. Charlie filed his mission report detailing the catastrophic damage, the loss of Sergeant Eckenrode, and the harrowing flight home. He mentioned the German fighter that had flown formation with them, but didn't make much of it. In the chaos of combat, strange things happened. Maybe the German had been out of ammunition. Maybe he'd had a gun malfunction. Charlie didn't know, and in the immediate aftermath, he had other concerns. Ye Olde Pub was written off as unsalvageable. The damage was too extensive. The airframe was retired. Its useful life ended after just a handful of missions. The crew was given a few days of rest and then reassigned to another aircraft. Charlie Brown flew more missions over Germany. He survived the war, completed his tour of duty, and returned to the United States. He tried to put the war behind him, tried to build a normal life. He worked various jobs, started a family, and rarely spoke about his experiences in the war. But he never forgot the German fighter pilot. As the years passed and the war became history rather than lived experience, the memory of that moment grew stronger. Who was he? Why had he spared them? What made him different? In the 1980s, Charlie began to search for answers. ACTSI seeks, the Cirques. Franz Stigler had survived the war as well, though his path was more difficult. He never told anyone about his encounter with the American bomber. Such an admission would have been suicide in Nazi Germany. He flew more missions, was eventually shot down, and spent the last months of the war as a flight instructor, teaching young pilots skills they wouldn't have time to master before being thrown into combat. After the war, Franz immigrated to Canada. He settled in Vancouver, British Columbia, started a business, and built a new life far from the ruins of Germany. Like Charlie, he rarely spoke about the war. The memories were too painful, too complicated. In 1986, 43 years after that December day over Germany, Charlie Brown placed an advertisement in a newsletter for former German fighter pilots. The ad was simple. He described the encounter, the date, the location, and asked if anyone remembered or knew who the pilot might have been. The response came from Vancouver. Franz Stigler had seen the ad. The details matched his memory perfectly. The date, the location, the description of the battered B-17. He'd carried the memory of that day for more than 4 decades, never speaking of it, never sharing what he'd done. He wrote to Charlie Brown, the Rhenian. The letters between Charlie and Franz were tentative at first. The war had made them enemies, and 43 years wasn't enough time to completely erase that history. But as they corresponded, as they shared their memories of that day, a remarkable friendship began to form. In 1990, Franz flew to the United States to meet Charlie face to face. The two men, now in their 70s, stood in Charlie's driveway and embraced like long-lost brothers. They spent hours talking, comparing notes, filling in the gaps in each other's understanding of that December day. Franz described what he'd seen from his cockpit, the dead gunner, the wounded crew, the impossible damage. Charlie described the terror of seeing a German fighter appear alongside them, the confusion when it didn't attack, the slow realization that the German pilot was protecting them. "You saved my life," Charlie said. "You and my crew, we all owe you our lives." Franz shook his head. "I didn't save you," he said. "You saved yourselves by flying that wreck home. I couldn't kill you. You were in a parachute." The two men became inseparable. They attended air shows together. They gave talks about their experience, about honor in war, about seeing humanity even in an enemy. They appeared in documentaries and were interviewed by historians. Their story became a testament to the possibility of moral choice even in the darkest circumstances. They lived near each other in later years, Franz in Canada and Charlie across the border in Washington state. They visited regularly, called each other often, and considered each other brothers in every way that mattered. The legacy. In 2008, Franz Stigler died at the age of 92. Charlie Brown died just 8 months later at 98 years old. They'd been given a gift that many warriors never receive: the chance to know the man they'd faced in combat, to understand him as a human being rather than just an enemy. Their story was documented in the excellent book A Higher Call by Adam Makos and Larry Alexander, published in 2012. I highly recommend it for anyone who wants to dive even deeper into this remarkable story. The authors conducted extensive interviews with both men before their deaths and with their families, creating a comprehensive account of that December day and its aftermath. But beyond the book, beyond the documentaries and interviews, the story of Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler raises profound questions about war, honor, and humanity. Franz Stigler had every tactical, strategic, and career reason to shoot down that B-17. It would have been his 28th kill. It would have earned him the Knight's Cross, Germany's highest military decoration. It would have advanced his career and possibly saved his life. Pilots with more victories were often rotated out of frontline service to become instructors, away from the deadly skies over Germany. Instead, he chose mercy. That choice didn't change the outcome of the war. Germany still lost. Thousands more bombers still pounded German cities. Thousands more people died. In the vast machinery of World War II, Franz's decision to spare one bomber crew was utterly insignificant to the war's outcome. And it was everything to Franz himself. Years later, when asked why he did it, Franz struggled to articulate his reasoning. "It was what Gustav taught me," he said, referring to his mentor Gustav Rudel. "You fight with honor, or you don't fight at all." Honor. That word seems almost quaint in the context of World War II, a war that saw the Holocaust, the firebombing of cities, the atomic bomb. A war that pushed the boundaries of human cruelty to unimaginable extremes. What place did honor have in such a conflict? For Franz Stigler, honor was everything. It was the line that separated him from the darkness. It was the thread of humanity he clung to while the world burned around him. Technical. Epilogue: Why Ye Olde Pub Flew. From an engineering perspective, the fact that Charlie Brown successfully flew Ye Olde Pub home remains remarkable. The B-17's reputation for toughness wasn't just marketing, it was based on real structural advantages. The aircraft's design philosophy emphasized redundancy and robustness. The 4-engine configuration meant the aircraft could theoretically fly on just 2 engines, though doing so required careful management of power and trim. The control surfaces, ailerons, elevators, and rudder had manual backup systems. Even with hydraulic failure, a strong pilot could physically move the controls through cable linkages. The airframe itself was semi-monocoque construction, meaning the skin carried some of the structural load, but the primary strength came from internal frames and stringers. This meant the fuselage could sustain significant damage and still maintain structural integrity. Multiple holes in the skin reduced aerodynamic efficiency and increased drag, but as long as the primary structural members remained intact, the aircraft could continue flying. The Wright Cyclone engines were air-cooled radial designs, inherently more damage-resistant than liquid-cooled engines. A bullet through a coolant line would cause a liquid-cooled engine to seize within minutes. The air-cooled radials could sustain multiple hits and keep running, at least for a while. But all of this engineering excellence would have meant nothing without skilled pilots. Charlie Brown and Pinky Luke kept that dying aircraft in the air through a combination of technical knowledge, physical strength, and sheer determination. They managed power settings, adjusted trim, compensated for asymmetric thrust, and fought with the controls for hours. That's not something any aircraft manual can fully prepare you for. It's skill, earned through training and revealed under pressure. The fact remains, however, that ye olde pub should not have made it home. The combination of damage was too extensive, the distance too great. By any reasonable calculation, that crew should have died over Germany or in the North Sea. They lived because a German fighter pilot chose mercy over duty. Closing. December 20th, 1943, was just another day in World War II. Thousands of men flew combat missions that day. Hundreds died, dozens of bombers were shot down, dozens more limped home with varying degrees of damage. In the grand scope of history, it was unremarkable. But for 9 American airmen and 1 German fighter pilot, it was the day that defined the rest of their lives. Charlie Brown carried the memory of that German fighter every day for 43 years before he found the man who'd spared him. When they finally met, when he finally looked Franz Stigler in the eye, Charlie said something simple but profound. Thank you. 2 words. 43 years in the making. Franz's response was equally simple. We were not enemies that day. We were just men trying to survive. That's perhaps the most important lesson from this story. War creates enemies. Artificial constructs of nationality, politics, and propaganda that turn human beings into targets. But beneath those constructs, beneath the uniforms and the flags and the rhetoric, we remain human beings capable of recognizing humanity in others. Franz Stigler saw past the enemy bomber to the terrified crew inside. He saw men who were somebody's sons, somebody's brothers, somebody's husbands. He saw human beings who wanted desperately to live. And in that moment, he chose to honor that shared humanity over his duty to his country. That choice cost him the Knight's Cross. It cost him recognition, advancement, perhaps safety. But it gave him something more valuable. It let him remain human in a world that demanded inhumanity. Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler died within 8 months of each other, having spent the final decades of their lives as brothers. 2 warriors who met in the sky as enemies and parted as friends. 2 men who proved that even in war, even when everything conspires to strip away our humanity, we can choose honor. We can choose mercy. We can choose to be better than the war demands we be. The German ace had his finger on the trigger. The target was helpless. The kill was certain, and instead of firing, he flew alongside them, protected them, and saved their lives. They started as enemies. They died as brothers. If you've made it this far in this story, thank you. This is the kind of aviation history that I believe deserves to be told in detail, with respect for the men who lived it and the complexity of the choices they faced. If you found this story meaningful, please hit that like button. It genuinely helps these stories reach more people who appreciate detailed, accurate historical accounts. And please subscribe to the channel. There are dozens more stories like this one that deserve to be told. Most importantly, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Did a family member serve in World War II? Have you heard similar stories of honor and humanity in combat? Where are you listening from? Your stories and perspectives make this community what it is, and I read every comment. Until next time, thank you for joining me for this journey through history. Remember the men who flew these missions, remember the choices they faced, and remember that even in humanity's darkest hours, there remain those who choose honor.